You're listening to the new Stalker Network.
I was one of those who saw the Oklahoma City bombing kind of come and go. I had some questions, but it never really went any further for me. So I'd like you to first kind of revisit your initial reaction to April 19th when the building was blown up, and progressively how you became to question more and got to the point of actually making a feature-length film about it.
Well, thank you, and I'll try to be as concise as I can. I was living in Austin, Texas at the time, working for my dad. Had a beautiful office complex right in the middle of the city, actually on the outskirts of Zilker Park, for anybody that is familiar with that. And it was just a regular Wednesday morning. I was actually his financial accountant and assistant to handle a lot of the books that he had with a nonprofit organization. Anyway, walk into the break room at a little after 9. The secretaries normally have their little coffee clutch and they're taking the break and they're in tears. And I walk in and it's like, what in the world is going on? I turn around and I remember looking at the small TV on the break room table, and there's a third of this building just completely gutted out. And I thought, holy cow, that's a heck of a gas explosion. So, obviously they had the helicopter, TV helicopters. They had, as we know now, OCPD and the State Highway Patrol helicopters flying over, making sure they weren't crashing into each other. And we're getting all kind of footage and feeds and so forth. And I thought, wow, that's it's a tragedy. And I believe the official story. I didn't have any reason not to. I'm 7.5 hour drive south. I really didn't know anybody in Oklahoma City. Anyway, fast forward to June of that year, end up dating a gal that her brother ended up being chosen to design the outside part of the memorial for the bombing. Marker number 2 there. I thought, well, that's great. That's nice. And he ended up winning a contract of $42 million. Studied architecture at MIT and was on sabbatical in Berlin when he was actually accepted. I go back in time, gentlemen, and I'm thinking of all of these little things that happened in the lead up to my interest in the case. But to a long story short, I was at a used bookstore in Fort Worth. I was married at the time and took my wife out shopping. It was just a random Saturday morning. And I walked into this bookstore and picked up this book. It's called The Secret Life of Bill Clinton. And it was written by Ambrose Evans Pritchard, who I've had the honor of talking to a few times. At the time, he was the bureau chief for the London Telegraph in Washington, D.C. But he had the opportunity to research a lot of the criminal elements of the Clinton administration before they actually moved to Washington in Arkansas. And 4 chapters in that book dealt with the connection to Oklahoma City. I thought, well, this is intriguing. And my little run-ins with in Oklahoma City indirectly over the years prior. But at the time, I was actually investigating. I took it upon myself to find out what was going on with the shoot down of TWA 800. And I'm not going to get into that. That's another story for another time. But my wife at the time, her job was threatened. She was working for TWA. When word got around to the union, which was based at Lambert Field, which is their headquarters in their home field in St. Louis at the time. And I was asked to step away from the case or else my wife would have gotten fired. And I thought, okay, that's when you get a little too close to the heat, when they start threatening your spouse with their job. And she had an impeccable record, no write-ups, nothing, for 16 years with the airlines. And they had the mitigated gall to threaten her with her job. So I set that all aside. 2 weeks later, out of the blue, somebody found out on the internet that I got my butt sacked on the TWA case. And I'm living in Fort Worth at the time, mind you. This is a 3.5 hour drive south of Oklahoma City. Still had no interest in the case. And he says, look, Chris, he says, I found out what happened here in TWA 800. Would you be interested in looking at this case? And I says, what is this, Jerry? I was just mentally trying to get over, have to walk away from 2.5 years of research on the other case. Mm-hmm. And he says, no, you've got to look at this. And I says, all right. I found out that he was credible. He worked with several people in the news industry, and he knew one of the lead stringer photographers at Channel 4, the NBC affiliate in Oklahoma City, who was able to squirrel away 2 hours and 45 minutes of unbelievable footage that was shot on the scene of the crime that morning. This was basically, it was on SVHS Masters, and they were able to actually run it straight from reel to reel in the Beta Masters at the TV station. And so I says, all right, I went over his house. I says, I'll give you an hour of my time. I didn't walk out of his house until 4.5 hours later. And I was shocked because what I saw on that tape, the first 45 minutes, completely just blew away the official narrative. There was graphic stuff on there of, literally the walking wounded coming out. And with all due respect to the walking wounded, the victims' family members and survivors, people were walking out of the building with their arms missing, with their hands missing. And this was being shot live. There's no way you're going to run this up the flagpole to CNN or ABC or CBS, any of the major flagship stations. They weren't even touching this stuff. But what was really telling was, as a friend of mine, as a PI that helped us out on the case, he says, you look for the people that are running away from the scene of the crime, not running toward it. And there was nobody running away, which means it was an inside job. This was planned prior to what really happened. And it was methodical. It was very well thought out. It was, they had ordnance in the building, we found out later, 23 devices that only 3 of them blew up. It was amazing. But what I saw on that was early on, the first 20 to 25 minutes after a crime is committed, that's when you're going to get your truth coming out. They were hauling out unexploded ordnance. They were bringing out bodies in parts of the building that nobody should have even got hurt. There were vehicles that were damaged, that were everything that was shot and it was seeing on that tape completely countered the official narrative. So I told Jerry, I says, okay, I'm going to have to look at this for about 6 months. I've had some money set aside. And I says, I'll research this and I'll give you my decision in 6 months. Well, at that point, and like I may have mentioned in the prior interview, I couldn't find anything that supported the official narrative. Nothing, except the fact that 169 people were brutally murdered, including 3 unborn children. So here we are at a threshold, gentlemen, that you start fresh. You say, okay, obviously the official narrative doesn't make any sense. Let's not waste our time on that. We'll be chasing our tail for, till the day we die. Let's go to where the facts lead us. And then that's when I started making my round trips to Oklahoma City, 14 round trips in the matter of, and during that 6 months. And I thought, wow, this is incredible. And I never looked back. And then one by one, I started meeting the Oklahoma City Bombing Investigation Committee. We were able to interview 3 members of that committee on the film. And I think you probably saw that. These guys are complete strangers. They came together, one is a survivor, one is a former state representative of the state house, who completely flushed his entire political career goodbye when he decided to look in the case. In fact, I'm going to his birthday party this coming weekend. He's probably one of my best friends I've ever had in my life. Charles Key's an amazing gentleman. He is the true gentleman's gentleman, just a very upstanding guy. And he's liked on both sides of the political aisle. He has the utmost respect. And then we had George Wallace, who chose for personal reasons not to be in the film. He was still concerned for his safety on some levels, and I respect that. Talked to him this morning. He's a retired Air Force colonel, and he knew bomb damage analysis and how ordnance works. And then we had the 4th gentleman, Dale Phillips, who we interviewed in there, multimillionaire in the insurance business. He saw how Charles was getting beat up night after night after night on the evening news or in the papers, and he says, that's it. I'm putting my foot down. I'm going to step up and help this guy because he's trying to do the right thing. And it was unbelievable, just a confluence of love and respect and just wanting to get the truth out on this case simply from a private citizen's point of view. Now, they weren't, these guys weren't Bush League. They hired out 2 professional investigators. They had almost $750,000 donated in the matter of 6.5 years to help them. We had multimillionaires, real estate millionaires from Chicago wanting to help them out, retired military officers. And they're sitting pretty good on their pensions. They were sending them checks every single month to help them out. So anyway, to answer your question, that was pretty much the genesis. That's where I came. And once I met the committee, I says, wow, we have to take this to a whole nother level. And they backed us up 100% from day one.
And the Channel 4 in Oklahoma City, that's the one that was, I believe you stated in the film, was really the last of the local outlets that continued reporting on it, and then about a year later they were bought, I believe, by the New York Times.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Which
the New
kind
York
of
Times
ended their broadcast.
That's correct. The New York Times, since it sold the station, I went back on Wikipedia and found that it was back in 2006, I believe. But that's typical. They just flop their assets and, they'll buy radio stations or whatever. But yes, it was about a year and a half. New York Times came in, and what I found out, and I had worked for CBS for 4 years as a contract employee at a third-tier market back in the early 80s, so I had somewhat of an idea how this worked, even though I wasn't an official employee of them. But you don't get fired in the news industry. You simply just don't have your contracts renewed. And depending on how your publicist or your agent negotiates your contract, you could be with them for a year, you could be with them for 2 or 5 years. If you're anchor, sometimes it's 5, 6 years. So the door swings both ways. If the TV station lets you go before that contract is up, they're obligated to pay out your contract. If you work your full contract, then the TV station, that's their first right of refusal. They say, hey, we don't need to renew that. That's exactly what happened with Liz Klinsing. She was a female news director, tough as nails. This woman, I have so much respect for her even to this day. And I corresponded with her, I believe, about 3 years ago. Last I heard, she was at a small station outside of Philadelphia after making the rounds from Oklahoma City to Denver to Philly. And that's the last I heard of her. But I tell you what, Melissa knew that this thing stunk to high heaven. You had Jana Davis, a very good reporter at the time, knew this thing stunk to high heaven, and she had a couple of members of the FBI field office. One of the public information officers from the field office here step up and say, hey, Jana, this is not right. This thing is completely upside down. And to preface that, gentlemen, I'll go back a second here. When I first moved here in January of 2003 to work on this film, I couldn't commute anymore. It was just too expensive. And so I decided to move here. It took me about 6 months to realize why the law enforcement and the search and rescue and the military personnel at the air base were so passionate about this case. It's because their friends' kids, their relatives, their family members were brutally murdered. Literally. There was no warning on this, and they were pissed. They were they were really upset, and not so much. It was bad enough that the deaths they had to endure, and all the funerals and everything, and the memorials they had to go to, but to have the top notch or the top level of the FBI and agencies from Washington D.C. flying into Tinker Air Force Base on 14 of the 24 Learjets that were from the presidential fleet at Andrews Air Force Base, and those guys coming in and tell these guys how to do their job, and to tell them how the drum's going to roll here and who's going to be marching in what direction and what's going to happen. No way. That ain't flying. So that animosity and that anger and that it just kept bubbling below the surface all those years. Even though I came on 8 years later, it was still, that was a wound that never would heal. And when they find out that we were working on this film, the feedback and the support, people coming out of the woodwork it was almost surreal. I was just very humbled, and I cried sometimes. I literally had to take a break and go to my cabin in the mountains outside of Albuquerque just to take a break from this and realize what was really taking place. And these people they weren't desperate, but they were anxious to get the information out. And I think I'm not a religious guy. I happen to believe in God. Some of your listeners may not. But I tell you what, there's a higher being that was guiding us on this. There's no way we would have got through this without that support. So I don't mean to go off on a tangent, but that's pretty much how things came together.
It's evident. You can feel that presence in watching the film. It's just amazingly well put together.
Well, thank you guys. We had limited resources, and we were a little bit bashful at first of releasing it because, wow, this isn't polished, but we did the best we could with what we had.
Yeah, it's not the cinematic quality necessarily. It's the content.
Yeah.
And the content is there. There's not a whole lot of beautiful vistas or things like that in State of Mind either, but it sure got the information out. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again about State of Mind. I highly recommend people watch it. It to me would be almost an unsurmountable topic to try to put in a film form that could reach multi-level, people of various degrees of intelligence or understanding, and make it understandable. and you were able to do that. So
Oh, you had a heck of a
very
team,
impressed.
you know, and
Oh, it takes more, yeah.
what do we coming up on a break here, a soft break?
I've got one, about 7-8 minutes.
Okay, and you know, I really this was a labor of love for about 75 people. About 10 of those people had passed on throughout the years, even before we had a chance to release the film. 2 of the people in the film, as you may know, VZ Lawton, he was a survivor from the 8th floor, came within about 3 feet of losing his life, literally. And then, of course, Hoppy Heidelberg, one of the members of the grand jury, federal grand jury, they have since passed since the movie was released. And for instance, Hoppy's funeral, this is a multimillionaire in the horse breeding business. He was well respected worldwide, head of several horse breeding associations. And it got to the point where he was harassed so much that his neighbors refused to even call him on his home phone. I mean, the best friends, neighbors, you know, farmers, they said, Hoppy, we don't want your number on our phone bill, and vice versa. And it was because the FBI was harassing him all the time. But I went to his funeral, and afterwards we had 7 firefighters, 3 from Blanchard, which is about 20 miles south of Oklahoma City. That's his hometown. And 4 from the Oklahoma City Fire Department come up to us and said, we love your film. I didn't even know these guys. They just recognized myself and a co-producer from the film. And we went out for coffee and lunch afterwards, and they said, our movie hit the firehouses all over the city. Guys were copying them, and said, that's fine. We just want the truth to come out. And it was amazing. Especially a lot of the rookie firefighters had no idea. Most of them were like in grade school at the time. So I guess that was an unintended, a good consequence of the film, that we were able to educate generations that simply didn't know, or possibly not even alive when that happened. So that's what we're trying to do, is pay it forward and try to at least give a more accurate accounting of a historic event than the official narrative, which is complete garbage. And I have no qualms about saying that. So
so many topics cover the same thought, but it just blows my mind that so many are afraid of so few.
Exactly.
And you know, when it's an individual thing, when individual people are being threatened, whether it's, you know, losing a job, or a spouse losing a job, or you know, more of a dangerous threat. I mean, this whole country right now is 300 plus million people being controlled literally by a few handfuls of people.
Well, it may be a few hands, but they've got a huge megaphone. Okay.
Right.
Oh, that's true.
And so this huge megaphone is controlling massive amounts of people. And, you know, we had, I kind of feel it was a wake-up moment. I think it was either Monday night show or maybe night show, where I asked Bob, I'm like, if I were to have come to you a couple of days after the Oklahoma City bombing and lay out all of the facts that are within this film, would have you listened to me? And his reaction was, no. Yeah, I would have thought you were crazy.
Same here, guys.
Yeah.
Same here.
I think I probably am in that bucket as well. But we know now from that historical event that pretty much set the table for 9/11/2001.
Yes.
You know, and I think that the account of the 26, is it unexploded, or 26?
23
devices were in the building. 3 of them went off, and 20 of them weren't exploded.
Chris, would you agree with me? They meant for that building to come down.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, we found out from a retired Criminal Investigation Division, which is the military arm of the FBI, their counterpart. He was on, this is a guy that he really supported the committee. And George Wallace, one of the committee members, said that this guy came onto the scene within about 30 minutes after the bombing happened. They already had a situation tent already being set up, and he happened to be in town. He was there doing some business out of Dallas, and his wife lived in Oklahoma City. His daughter went to a college here in state. And this is what he did for a living for over 18 years with the Army, was to write white papers and position papers for the Pentagon on bomb damage analysis. And he was very good. In fact, he had worked for a contractor with the State Department. Even though he was officially retired, they would send him out to help the FBI with like the U.S. embassy bombings, or even some of our allies, their embassy bombings. I mean, it was a mess. And so he walks onto the crime scene. They give him a hard hat and a badge, ID badge. And within 10 minutes of his visit, he's already starting to ask questions. He says, look, your rebar is blown this way. You got damage over here. The truck was over here. Why are these columns 50 some feet away completely, disintegrated, 6-7 feet gone? I mean, can you imagine a pillar almost 4 feet in diameter, 6 feet of it turned to chalk dust? When you literally reassemble this building from the photos and the videos that we were able to get and coordinated with the architect plans, where did 6 feet of this column go? It just disintegrated. That doesn't happen. But then you have some of the columns that are less than 12 feet away from where the truck was allegedly blew up, and the drywall wasn't even singed. The trim is in pristine condition. It makes no sense. And he said right then he knew that this was contact charge. And he could still smell some of the odor from the C4 that was coming out. He says they'd smell this stuff all the time in the jungles. And the reason being is it would linger so long in the jungles is because of the humidity. The moisture in the air would hold it there. There was no wind. So he smelled it immediately. And he was asking questions, and his minder, his escort from the U.S. Army says, look, give me your hard hat and your tag. And within that half hour that he was with this guy, they already knew where his wife worked, where his kid had gone to school, and they said, you keep your mouth shut. They pretty much ran down where they knew where his spouse worked and his kid went to school. And they said, we can't guarantee their safety.
Wow.
Point blank, right at his face. And he said, from there, he says, once he found out about the committee getting together about 3 weeks later, he says, I'm on your side, guys. We need to find out what the hell happened here.
Well, a lot has changed in technology since 1995. I hope that some people could start having the courage and the forethought when dealing with some of these people to start getting some recordings of things like your wife works at X and X, your children go to school here,
right?
And I can't guarantee their safety.
Well, all right. I don't want to keep interrupting you. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I just hope that we can start to break this pattern, because this happens on all these events.
Oh yeah, people get wiser, and with the way technology is, I mean, even with the Boston bombing, that was a fiasco, a complete mix-up there, and you could see things were staged. But we wouldn't have been able to really jump on that with the likes of your show, or Alex, or several other of my colleagues in the radio business, filmmakers that were there, to see how that whole story just completely fell apart in about 45 minutes. It's and even it took a lot longer for the story to assemble here in Oklahoma City, but at least a lot of the conscientious people within the news media, some of them I found out had to retire. They had nervous breakdowns because their jobs were.
We're going into our top of the hour break, Chris. When we come back, we'll be back in a few minutes. I want to have a little bit of a theme, and that's a theme of prior knowledge. We're speaking with Chris Emery. We'll be back after this break. Welcome back, Chris. And I want to kind of go with a theme here.
Sure.
There were a few different things that really grabbed my attention in watching this movie. One of them was a woman who had worked in the building, and she was talking about how, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms had offices there. But she said you would never know who the people were because of the way they would be dressed. But on that morning, for the first time, they were wearing their ATF jackets that were very clean. They didn't come out of the building with those jackets on. And then there's also the story regarding the elevators, claiming that they actually had two people in the building, and that one of them had been in a free fall in an elevator. And you point out through testimony from people that inspected the elevators that didn't happen.
That's correct.
So let's touch a little bit on who may have known what ahead of time.
Well, good question, gentlemen. When I had started working with the committee, and even before I moved here in November of 2002, they were just wrapping up their operations. Their funding had ended. And Charles Key had invited me over to the office for the last time to help him pack. He had to go out to Office Depot to get some supplies and tape and so forth. And he said, look, here's the keys. Make yourself at home. You're welcome to look through. What I came upon in the file cabinets and some of the boxes, to answer your question, they had gotten intel from the U.S. Marshal's office, several offices around the U.S. These guys were sending them what they knew before the bombing, after the fact, when they found the committee was convened to investigate. The Saudi royal family security detail, this is the House of Saud, was sending the committee intel that they had. Scotland Yard, RCMP, which is based out of Ottawa, which is the Canadian version of the FBI, the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, as well as several other intelligence agencies. Interpol, retired members with Interpol were sending the committee stuff that they knew about. So the issue of prior knowledge is not even up for debate anymore. That's ironclad, based on these documents. And to make it doubly sure, we had they had the two private investigators that they hired on full time to make sure that this information was vetted and it was true. And they said, yes, this is authentic. This is coming off of their version of the teletypes or their secret cables that were exchanged between the different offices, electronic cables. So, it's okay. They had prior knowledge. Why? And the second question was, why didn't they share this? And it was ego wars and turf wars. The FBI and the CIA weren't working together. ATF wasn't working with the FBI in a lot of instances. So it was a catastrophic, absolutely catastrophic breakdown in communication. If that intel was shared, there's no way this case would have carried through like it did. But we also have to add a whole nother layer, and a lot of people aren't aware of this, and it took me about a year to wrap my mind around this. Who had a vested interest in making sure that this building went down? This wasn't Tim McVeigh being hacked off about the Waco incident. As we show in the film, he was working for the CIA, as well as joint intel with the FBI and the ATF. And we weren't able to develop on that in the movie because we didn't want to hit people with a fire hose of information. It would have been so overwhelming that it's like, this can't be true. So we really had to back up. We had to pull in the reins on the 16 horses in front of the wagon, so to speak, and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going at a walk. We're not going to gallop. We're not going to run like, a bat out of hell. And the information we had on the prior knowledge, like I said, all of the sources we had, clearly showed that McVeigh knew this was going to happen, but it was supposed to happen at 9 o'clock the night before with no body count. It was his handler, number 2 at the FBI, and I have no problem saying this. I mean, if Mr. Potts has an issue, he's welcome to call me on my phone because I'm sure he darn well knows what my phone number is. And I'll chew his backside up, one down and the other, because I know that he was involved. He knew what the hell was going on with this case. He told McVeigh to go off script because he wanted a body count. I mean, that is ruthless. That is just that's sick. That's sociopath.
Mm-hmm.
So,
19 children.
Guys, I was looking at right before we released the film, we scanned 1,800 photos. A lot of them were from the K-9 crews and search and rescue that were being debriefed at the airbase every single day for that 23 days that the building was standing, and even afterwards, they were debriefed for about 2 weeks after that on what they found, the photos that they took, and where the body parts were. Come on, let's be pragmatic here. A lot of those bodies were not whole. If you can imagine the damage in that building, and you getting in the middle of that, forget it. And so they were debriefed on all that, but we had a sympathetic, he's a retired officer, I'm not going to put his name or his rank or anything, but he was in charge of the photo lab that did all of the, he handled electronic communication and photos and developing for Tinker Air Force Base. And he gave us a treasure trove of photos that the FBI never, ever got their hands on. And we were able to scan 1,800 of those in our hard drives. And out of that, there were blueprints the Southwestern Bell telephone had of the building. They gave them to a lot of the lawyers on behalf of the families because there was a heck of a lot of litigation. There was insurance claims coming, don't make no question about that. Because the GSA wasn't giving these lawyers, the GSA was the government agency that was in charge of designing this building back in the 70s. So Southwestern Bell stepped up, as they should have. And I saw blueprints of the second floor, and they laid out exactly where these children were, to the best of their knowledge where they were before the bombing. And on the front window, facing 5th Street, there were 4 children under the ages of 4 months, laying in their cribs sound asleep. And when I saw that, I says, not only no, but hell no. We're not stopping until we find out what happened here. This is unbelievable that they were so gutless and so heartless to kill babies like that. Adults is one thing. When you start killing the children, that's a whole nother level of of complete sickness and sociopath. So that really made our film crew bound and determined to figure out what happened here.
I've got a question. In our last interview with you, which I'm still like starstruck by that one, Chris. I'll be honest with you. Yeah,
Tingle.
I get you. We've got that tingle thing happening here. In the last interview, I learned from you that Timothy McVeigh thought that they were going to be doing the bombing 12 hours earlier.
Yes, at 9 p.m. on April the 18th.
And what do we have to document that, or because I mean, why would they try to do this at night? That just doesn't make sense to me.
Well, what it was is supposed to be a staged attack. In fact, we have Oklahoma County Sheriffs, the Oklahoma County Bomb Squad, a division of the Sheriff's Department. We had Highway Patrol and some OCPD officers actually monitoring the building. They started getting their BDUs, their body armor, and in fact, there was a 4-lane road about a mile west. I was looking at the street map and trying to figure this whole thing out, what happened 12 hours before. You had 4 different law enforcement agencies working together to figure out. They knew that there was going to be a Ryder truck pulled in front of a building downtown. They didn't know where, and they really didn't know when, but they had intel to bring it down within about a 10-block area. And traffic was just bottlenecked from the interstate going downtown. It was ridiculous. I mean, you don't get that kind of traffic backed up at 3 in the morning. And so these guys were hot on the trail. They figured something was going on. But at 6 o'clock, they called everything off. 6 o'clock the morning of the bombing. So to answer your question, that's as far as documenting, at least we knew from the agencies that was going to happen. And Terry Nichols testified. Basically, he gave this information to Jesse Trinidad, who was his legal counsel of record when he was at the federal lockup. He told him what McVeigh had told Nichols before this whole thing happened, that Larry Potts told him to go off script. And we also got it from 3 other people that McVeigh talked to while he was on death row in Terre Haute. So, there's a lot of, you have people that didn't even know each other coming together with the same amount of information.
And that leads me to another question, actually a couple of them really, but the person that was either a cellmate with Tim McVeigh,
right?
He's also on record saying that Timothy McVeigh had told him he wasn't going to die.
Right. David Paul Hammer you're referring to, and I'd corresponded with David a few times through email. He's in Terre Haute. You're right. And that brings back, I think we finished the last interview with people, I think a lot of people asked me, do you think McVeigh's dead? And I said, no, I don't even hesitate about that, because he was a CIA asset, and you don't kill off your assets. Well,
and there was a couple key anomalies in his execution, in that he was cremated right away, and there was no autopsy when it was protocol to autopsy all those who had been executed.
Very interesting twist on that, gentlemen. I'm glad you brought that up, and I'll be as short as I can on this. James Nichols, Terry Nichols' brother, we were able to correspond by email and talk several times on the phone before Terry was brought up on state charges. What a lot of people don't understand is that the federal trials only handled the federal employees that were in the building. The non-federal employees, civilians, Social Security office and whatnot, there was, I believe, 100, and after everything was said and done, I believe 160, including the 3 unborns. The state of Oklahoma, that was their jurisdiction. So his trial started in March of 2004. Well, in 3 months leading up to that trial, and the 3 months of the trial, right before the final verdict was read in June, James and I kept in touch, and he says, what happened with Tim when he was at death row is that there were 3 different hearses out the back of the death row, wherever they did the lethal injection, the special housing unit there, just, surrounded with barbed wire and cyclone fence, the whole bit. Those 3 hearses were put there on purpose to throw off the media. So they all drove out in different directions, and nobody knew what was in the hearse, or if there was anything at all. It was Tim Popovich, who's a paralegal out of upstate Michigan, and James, who actually, oddly enough, were befriended by Tim McVeigh's dad, his birth dad. And it was Tim McVeigh's dad that wanted the body. He had every right to ask for the body.
Mhm.
And the federal authorities at the death row, and even the warden, told him to pretty much drop the F-bomb several times. They told him to get lost. And they handed him an urn with ashes. Well, they didn't know if that was Tim. I mean, how disrespectful is that? At least the least you could do, all right, he's dead. Give the dad his body. They never even extended that courtesy. So we don't know. I honestly don't think he's dead. I mean, there's, like I said, why would you kill off a CIA asset? He was top notch. He was a professional assassin and a drug smuggler for 2.5 years before the bombing. Again, that's not even up for debate. We've seen records of that in the Defense Council records.
You know, when I first saw A Noble Lie, it sent me into research mode for probably 6 months. And one of the things that I kind of hit upon that was shocking to me was the Chandra Levy connection and somebody had, it was in one of the reports that I had read, where actually she was either representing some paralegal team that was interviewing McVeigh or whatever, but the Chandra Levy name, did that ever come up in your research? And
it did, oddly enough. And obviously, since she was passed away, she was actually working in some capacity with the Bureau of Prisons when McVeigh was incarcerated. Now, McVeigh was actually here at a federal prison in Oklahoma City, in El Reno, which is about 32 miles west of downtown Oklahoma City. Then he was taken into custody and flown to Denver, and he was incarcerated there. And then they took him to the federal courthouse downtown for the trial, and he actually made a small room, a quasi-hotel room, because it was a lot cheaper just to keep him there. Security would have been horrendous, transferring him back and forth to the federal prison outside of town. So they just had to keep him right there. But getting back to Chandra Levy, we don't know what she knew. The Bureau of Prisons is worse than the military. I mean, it's its own. It's like the Vatican. It's its own enclave. They report to nobody except themselves. You think military jurisdiction is tight. You don't know that until you deal with the Bureau of Prisons. And that is led on in another part of the movie with the murder of Kenny Trinidad. But to get back to Chandra Levy, gentlemen, when I was in Washington, D.C. in 2005, I spoke about this case at American University. Went out there with Charles Key. On the way back, the morning I was flying back to Oklahoma City, the cabbie and I got in a conversation. And we talked about the film, and he pulled his cab over on the side of the expressway, not far from the Pentagon. And I'll never forget this. It's 5:30 in the morning. The lights are coming on the Pentagon, and he says, looks at me, just point blank, turns around, throws the car in park, and he says, "Do you know about Chandra Levy's connection to the case?" I thought, wow. He says, I got a story to tell you about that. So he shared it with me, and I passed it on to Charles after we got back to Oklahoma City, separate flights. And I said, what's going on with this? And he said he had both of his PIs follow up on that, but once they got to the Bureau of Prisons, bam, the whole trail went cold. Couldn't do anything beyond that. So you can't put that in the movie unless you have documentation. It all vanished.
Wow.
Yeah. So I had this cabbie tell me about this, and I found out who this cabbie was. I called his boss, and he'd been driving for 26 years. He's seen more stuff in the backseat of his cab. He's driven around more powerful members of Congress and even White House aides that didn't want to do the limo thing. They want basically just a private town car service, or just a unnamed cab just to take them around. And he saw a lot of stuff, but he says one thing that made his blood run cold was when he heard that Chandra Levy story.
And one last thing, and then I want to talk about your upcoming release. Mm-hmm. The missing, or the extra leg.
Oh yeah.
Did they have? Can you tell our listeners, or maybe go into a little bit more detail on the extra leg story?
Yeah. Here's the Fred Jordan was the he was the state medical examiner at the time. Can you imagine the FBI coming to him with a straight face and saying, "Hey, look, we found an extra leg, but we want you to sign off as though it was part of one of the victims that we recovered from the bombing." And the medical examiner looked at him like, "Have you lost your mind? This is an extra leg. There is no body to account for. I'm not signing off on anything." And he told him to get out of his office. He kicked him out. And in fact, at the time, the medical examiner has more power over autopsies and certain signing rights on documents than the governor does. So to get to your story, that leg is actually buried here in Oklahoma City at an arbor park north of the Capitol building. And it's sitting under a large piece of granite that was actually part of the Murrah building at the time. To this day, nobody knows who that leg belongs to. The only way they'll be able to find out is if it's exhumed and DNA tests are run. But the best that we found out, even from the defense counsel records, and McVeigh blurted this out during, not during the trial, but the discovery process, talking to his counsel. He says that it was a leg from a prostitute that he had hired a few nights before, had his way with her, and he cut her throat and threw her in the back of the truck. And he was just matter of fact about it. It's like another day at the office for him. He's just cold. Wow. Cold as ice. And but we did find out it was a female leg, and we did find out that it was of African American descent. And he said, yeah, she was a African American prostitute. And here again, how ridiculous for the FBI to ask our medical examiner to sign off on that. I mean, what would you guys do if somebody asked you to do that? It's ludicrous.
Well, I would immediately question why they particularly would want
They
me to do
didn't want that trail. You're right. There were so many rabbit trails flying out of this case. They wanted to button up every single one of those trails to lead back to only two guys. And they didn't want McVeigh, saying that he did this or the other thing, because that would have brought in a lot more people into the whole act of this thing, and they didn't want that. So they'll just ignore a leg. They'll ignore a body.
Yeah. Well, we've got a little over 3.5 minutes left. We would like to have you tell us about the project that you're working on now. I'm pretty excited about it. Already waiting. I've already got popcorn waiting to go.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's actually, the working title is New World. Let me back this up here. Shadow Ring. I'm sorry. We were going through 3 or 4 working titles. Shadow Ring, New World Architects. And it's based on the book called Shadows of Power by James Perloff, best-selling book. It was released in 1988. That deals strictly with the Council on Foreign Relations. So we're going to take a similar approach to what we did with State of Mind, Psychology of Control, change the subject matter, and go through very thoroughly on an academic and historic basis on how the Council on Foreign Relations came to be, what they do, who is actually involved with it, and why they're still in power. What are they doing today? Matter of educating, and then we offer some solutions. We're interviewing at least 23 experts on the case, both male and female, different age groups, and you'll recognize some of them. Some are going to be new faces. And our crew is actually out on the road as we speak. They're going to be wrapping up the East Coast tour. Have 2 more interviews this week. Going to take a 5-day break and then head on to the West Coast for 14 days. We're just very, very honored. I mean, when we asked these people, we had a wish list of 30 people we wanted to interview. 27 came on board, blew us away. It's great. It's going to be a great movie, and we're very honored and blessed to have the opportunity to put it together.
Well, and we look forward to it. They've been a topic of ours. We were just discussing before we began our interview tonight. We had talked about them previously when we played a clip of Hillary Clinton speaking to the Council on Foreign Relations. They had opened a new office or something in Washington. And in that clip, she states that it's handy because she just needs to go across the street to find out what they want her to do next.
Yeah, in fact, I think we're going to use that clip in the film. Yeah, she's not even trying to hide this anymore. They're so arrogant, over the top.
Well, and I and with a lot of this, even we've only got about a minute left, but I tell you, one of the things that really struck me in the film was Governor Keating. Was it a brother or a relative of Governor Keating who was writing a novel about a bombing in Oklahoma City that was done by a Tom McVeigh?
His brother Martin, actually.
His brother Martin was writing that. Just bizarre.
Yeah, in fact, the manuscript for that book was released in March of 1994, the full 13 months prior to the bombing happening.
Yeah, and I think the theme, and I'll tell you one thing that I noticed from you, from us talking to you a couple times now, is that we're all kind of cut of the same cloth, because we do have fun on this show. We do have a different approach than some others that do shows like this, because we don't want to be gloom and doom. We don't want to sound like we're continually scared. But we do get very passionate. We talk about these stories, and when it comes to children being killed, and when it comes to people knowing things are going to happen like this, or planning these things and being so heartless, it's just hard to not get emotional when you talk about some of these stories. So, and I think that passion carries through into
Thank
the
you,
films.
gentlemen. I
that's,
appreciate
just
your
more credit
support.
to you.
And like I said, after we're done, I'd like to get your contact information. We'll help you out, expand your listenership.
Well, that would be great. That would be great. Again, I've been speaking with Chris Emery, filmmaker, researcher, and vice president of marketing for Free Mind Films. Find the films, buy the films, watch them, and share them. Thanks again, Chris.
Have a good evening, gentlemen. God bless.
You as well.